Hello and welcome. Greetings from the Offensive Security Group here at Secure IT 360, coming at you with another episode of the Cyber Threat Perspective. And so we're going to continue on the journey of the multi-part series with regards to different types of penetration testing and just kind of diving deep into those and talking about each one individually. So you've got me, Brad, and you've also got Darius that's back here with us again to talk about web app pen testing, which is something that, I'm super excited to talk about just because I've been doing it for a very, very long time. And, it's just a fun topic to talk about. So do you want to just kind of take us away, Darius?
Yeah, so welcome everyone. If this is your first time listening to the podcast, I'm Darius. I'm a pen tester here at Secure IT 360, and I focus primarily on our web app pen test. To kind of start, what is a web app pen test? Well, a web app pen test essentially is an assessment of a web app, and primarily when I say a web app, I mean the underlying code of the application itself. And this is something that is extremely important because in today's day and age, I guarantee everyone, as far as interacting with the internet, you're utilizing a web app and by further extension an API
Yeah.
pretty much every single day. In fact, if you're listening to my voice right now, there's a good chance you're probably using a web app. And so, because of this use of these web applications and APIs and how integrated they are nowadays, man, they're a huge target for threat actors. And when it comes, that's the whole reason why we have web app pen tests. That's why we do them to hopefully come in, save the day, and prevent some of these threats and vulnerabilities from being exploited by the threat actors. We're here to find them beforehand.
Yeah.
Um,
No, that makes perfect sense, man. And we have to separate it, as with any kind of penetration testing that we do, there has to be lines. And so, with a web app, we're talking specifically, you mentioned code. I think that's an important distinction because in most cases, a web application, we kind of broadly define it in the IT world as, a set of code that's running on a web service, and it's kind of this, folder or set of files, for lack of a better analogy, that just kind of runs on that system. And so that doesn't look at things like the underlying operating system or the configuration of your firewall or different, all of these other moving parts, right, that are important and they're part of the IT ecosystem. But right, we're just focused on the app and not necessarily everything around it, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like one common thing that we see on a lot of our engagements is the WAF example. It's like, oh well, I have a web app firewall and it's filtering out certain things, so my web app isn't vulnerable to cross-site scripting, and that's not always the case. And that's something that we try to work with customers with. The goal of the web app pen test is to test against the web app. We're not here to test the third-party controls such as the web application firewall. We want to test the code. So your code could be vulnerable to cross-site scripting, and it's awesome that you have a WAF in front of it and it's blocking the majority of cross-site scripting attempts. But what happens when someone inevitably finds a bypass for your WAF? Well, if your application is still vulnerable, boom, it's now exploited. So yeah, like that's something that's huge that we deal a lot with. Is we're here to test the application itself and the code. Additionally, as far as what we care about is let's say we're able to go from web app to the underlying system. That tends to be where now we're kind of crossing the borders a little bit to where now potentially it's an internal pen test. Ultimately, while that's extremely cool and I love when it happens, even that's not the point of a web app pen test. That's a finding. We'll write it up. But even still, after initial just access to the underlying server, I'm gonna, step back out and continue to test the application itself.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And another kind of talking about that WAF example that you had earlier, one of the big things that we test for is a category of testing called business logic. And so I want to dive super deep into that, but basically what that means is that we're testing that the application functions in the way that it was intended to function, right? And this is something a web application firewall will never find, has no idea about. And my favorite example is using the wire transfer example. And so when you're going to wire money, if you're going to do it, through your online banking platform, you go in and you click a source account, you click a destination account, and you send the money, right? It's very simple. The problem enters if you're not properly validating that the source account belongs to the person who's logged in. If I can change that from my account to your account, well, I just wired your money to the other account instead of mine. And no amount of web application firewall blacklisting and regex rules are going to prevent me from doing that if it's the way the application was written. So we don't just test for the obvious stuff like that too. We also look for these business logic flaws. And so your like golden magical WAF that you're relying on to protect your application suddenly is completely irrelevant. And I just wire transferred every dime you had out of that application.
No, you're exactly right. I think you hit the nail on the head, not to go too deep into it. But a lot of times when it comes to the security of the web app, it really just comes down to how is it designed.
Yeah.
And it's the classic case of shift left. So the sooner you implement proper security into your software development lifecycle, the better off you're going to be overall.
Okay, so I have a question about that. So where does a web application penetration test fit in that process?
Ooh, that's a good question. So that's actually, it can be subjective, but personally, what I like to see is I would do it per release.
Okay, that makes sense.
Or at least prior to release, at some point, you should have a web app pen test. But there should be you should implement some other things into your SDLC prior to. You might want to implement some SAST or some DAS scans as well, just to find low-hanging fruit.
Yeah.
And then even going a step before then, really making sure you're analyzing the design of your web app or your API before you even hands on keyboard I'm developing. A prime example of that I would say is I've seen it, or we've seen it a couple of times, where it's like, yeah, we have all of these controls to sanitize and validate inputs, and we're doing it all on the client side.
Yeah.
And that's fantastic. It's awesome that you are doing that on the client side. But what about on the server side? Because in instances like that, all I'm going to do is just completely forego your GUI, and I'm just going to hit the web app by using, I'm going to hit the API directly and just forego the web app. And now all the security controls that you implemented now mean nothing.
Sure.
So, really, it's really important that you properly design your application.
Yeah. And that's a really good, to kind of build on that point, is any form of penetration testing is not enough as a standalone security solution, right? The reality is it is kind of like the final exam, or it should be. In a lot of cases, clients will utilize pen testing to discover vulnerabilities and try to, go out and enumerate all of their systems. And that's cool, man. Don't get me wrong. We love doing that stuff. The reality is, though, the pen test should be confirming that your existing controls work properly, the way that you intended them to work. And so I like the way you describe it, right? We start out, we design it securely, and then we implement different security checks along the road. And then, that kind of falls into that secure SDLC, and there's a million names for it out there. But I do think that the web app pen test is kind of a mandatory part of that process because of all of the things you just described, because of the fact that, other controls may be lacking, whether it's implementing input validation in the wrong place, or whether it's throwing a WAF out there and calling it good. At the end of the day, you need a human being that looks like Darius to put his hands on a keyboard in front of your app and be sure that it's in the right place.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
So I kind of have an idea of how web app pen test works and like what its focus is. One other thing that we should talk about too is the focus of that is not on the infrastructure. We get that question sometimes where it's like, are you going to port scan my web server when you do a web app pen test? Like, no. We're not. We don't care, right? I don't care about the patch level of your operating system. I don't care about necessarily what your Cisco, router is out in front of it. I'm really focused in on the actual dynamic code of the web application itself. And occasionally we'll see things come into play like, a vulnerable version of Apache lends itself to like a stack of attacks. But in most cases, we're focused on the code, right?
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. So yeah, we're focused on basically insecure code, right? And even I would also add the use of insecure third-party libraries. That's a
Oh, yeah.
very common one because the reality is development is extremely complex. There are a a million different frameworks that are out there from what web development framework you're going to use to what JavaScript framework you're going to use. There's so much complexity that can come with the web app. And a lot of times the easiest thing to do is just, hey, I'm just going to use this third-party library and call it a day.
Sure.
And if that isn't secure, well, then now your web app isn't secure. And that's
Yeah.
another common thing that we see. I know another difference I would say from web app pen testing versus other forms of pen testing is we get credentials and a lot of times admin access up front.
Yeah.
So with your externals or internals, you normally don't get a set of creds, but with web app pen testing, we want credentials up front because, like you said, the point is to test the web application. A common example of why we want multiple accounts is I may have an admin account, and that admin account has access to admin functions of the web app. But what happens if I just take the URL for that admin function and as a normal user, I just directly navigate to it? Or what happens, let's say it's an API, and what happens if I take a normal user token and try to hit an admin endpoint with that normal user token? Would that normally happen? Probably not, but as threat actors are they're going to manipulate and they're going to play around with that.
Oh, yeah.
And if you don't have the proper controls in place, you may be able to elevate your privileges and basically access things you shouldn't. So that's slight tweak and a slight difference from other forms of pen test.
That's a really good point. And you actually hit on something else too that I thought was really cool. And that is talking about misses from other controls in the secure software development lifecycle that you pick up with pen testing. The fact that there are so many different languages and libraries out there make it really hard for static scanners and even dynamic scanners to be effective because the rate at which we change the languages and methods and types of programming that we do far exceeds the rate at which we're updating these scanners. And so the nice thing about it is all of that stuff is irrelevant to a manual penetration tester, right? I mean, we kind of care a little bit like, okay, yeah, you're using JavaScript libraries. All right, your jQuery is out of date. We already know that. Just add that to the report at the beginning of every engagement. But but the manual work that we do is kind of removed from the platform that it's built on. These are universal tests that apply and are relevant across all languages and development platforms. So, question for you though: who needs to get a web app pen test? Like, how do I know that that's what I need to do?
Okay. Yeah. So, man, I would start by saying, man, if you have a publicly facing web app or API, you need a web app pen test. If it's out on the internet, threat actors are going to hammer it, so you might as well get a pen test. But I would also, by further extension, say if you're utilizing a third-party service, you want to make sure that that also gets a pen test, or you want to make sure that the company that owns it, they're periodically doing pen tests as well. So a prime example I would use is let's say you utilize Slack, right, for instant messaging. It's awesome. It's a web app. But what happens with, I think I remember a couple of years ago, there's something with, yeah, you upload a file to Slack and there was a vulnerability regarding that.
Mm-hmm.
As far as how those files were secured. that's there are so many companies that are putting, sensitive information in files, just transferring them via Slack. So you want to make sure that Slack is performing pen tests so they can
Yeah.
find it and then close that loophole.
Yep. And so there, yeah, there's kind of two categories, right? Category one is I write code as part of my company and I publish that, or even if I don't, even if it's internal, my custom code needs to get a pen test. Or if I am a consumer of someone else's custom code, like in the Slack example that you have, I at least want to ask that question of Slack. Like, are you guys doing web app pen testing? And if you're not, can I? Because one of the things that we do semi regularly is pen test a third party. So, if I'm company A and I want to buy, um, this software as a service, does that vendor allow me to seek out my own penetration testing for that platform? In a lot of cases, the answer is yes. Salesforce is a great example. We pen test against Salesforce, I don't know, 6, 7 times a year. Different components of it. We have to get permission, obviously, from Salesforce to do it. But when we do, we're doing it on behalf of the consumer of that, the client that wants to buy it. So that makes sense. So if I do go out and I pursue getting a web app pen test, first of all, I'm going to call Security 360, right? So like, I don't have to worry about it. But if I don't, right, and there are a lot of folks out there doing web app pen testing, how do I know I'm getting a real web app pen test? And what are, well, I'll ask that second question later. So how do I know I'm getting a good pen test?
Yeah, so I think for starters, before you even get to the point of deliverables, I think it starts with the preparation process.
Mhm.
So when you're dealing, whoever you're dealing with, you want to make sure you have a clear and defined scope. So if they're not asking scoping questions, probably a bad sign. But I think that
Yeah.
goes for all forms of pen testing. If they're not asking, if they're not trying to understand your business and the application that's being used prior to, that right there, I think is a pretty good indicator, because it's, there are millions of web apps out there. Your company may have a lot, but the web app that seems small and insignificant could be the one that's the most vulnerable and
Oh yeah.
provide the most risk for your company. So it's really important that they're asking questions about, who would normally use this application, what's the workflow, et cetera, things like that. Can be a pretty good indicator. Something that, also kind of subjective that can be helpful is, if they ask for the source code to the application. That right there, in my opinion, is a pretty good sign, because having access to the source code, as a tester, sometimes, a lot of times, just by reading the code, you can identify vulnerabilities before even navigating to the homepage. So,
Sure.
if they're asking for that during the preparation process, and it's completely up to you whether or not you want to give it or not. But that right there is at least a good sign that, hey, the person I'm engaging with knows their stuff, and I can, at least expect a certain level of competency when it comes to my web app pen test. Um, as far as deliverables go, I would say, one, the methodology they use and what they reference. So, the big one is always going to be OWASP.
Sure.
If they're referencing and utilizing that, I think that right there is thumbs up, great sign that they know what they're talking about. Something else you may want to look at are their certifications and references. So there's a ton of web app certs, but something else to consider is, do they participate in bug bounties? I think
Yeah.
that right there is a huge indicator. If you have someone that's like, yeah, I'm a part of this bug bounty program. I think one that I really enjoy is the Synap Red Team. They're pretty good.
Mhm.
Um, but if they participate in programs like that, and they kind of have that reputation about them of, I know how to find bugs in web apps. That right there, is a great sign. And then the last thing I will say, and I think this goes for all forms of pen testing, is if you get a report and there are zero findings,
Oh, that's a huge red
yeah,
flag.
you didn't get a quality pen test, in my opinion,
Yeah.
because there's always going to be something.
Sure. And I'll add to that too. Cost is important. Like if and we have this occasionally, someone will come to us and they'll, and by the way, we actually probably should talk a little bit before we end this podcast um, on scoping and like what to expect. But one of the things that we find interesting is occasionally a client will come to us. We'll go through the scoping process, which is not a simple process, by the way. There's actually a lot of work that goes into that. And then at the end of it, we'll give them a quote or an estimate or whatever, and they'll say, "Oh wow, well I've been working with this overseas company, and they said they can do my pen test for $1,200." And like, listen, buddy, I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this, but you're not getting a web app pen test, not by a qualified individual. And so, that's when I would point back to what you just said, all of those things, right? What are their qualifications? What are their references? What is their methodology? And that's really, I think the methodology thing is the one that sinks most of their ships. And what I mean by that is, are you guys doing, you know, detailed business logic testing? Are you guys doing proper input validation on the client and the server side? Are you guys inspecting the DOM with relation to how that app operates in the browser? And you're going to start getting some blank looks from that third party when you start asking them that. So, so I guess to say, kind of summarize all of that with how do I know I'm getting a good web app pen test is, don't just go to a company and say, hey, I want a web app pen test, and then just take whatever they give you. You have to do a little bit of investigative work on your side to make sure that they're qualified to do the work. Because there are, unfortunately, in this industry, a lot of folks out there doing this work that are unqualified to do it.
I agree.
Yeah.
Going back to just backpedaling a little bit as far as, good signs that you're going to get a good web app pen test. One that I forgot earlier is, are they a developer?
That's a great one. Yeah.
I think that's one that it's the best way to break something is to know how to build it. And so, one thing that I think we see a lot is it's tough to perform a web app pen test if you don't have any development experience, because you're not going to know how do things plug together.
Yeah.
So yeah, having a former or current developer perform your web app pen test, great sign, highly recommend.
Yeah. And an added side benefit to that you get with us as well would be that when it comes time to deliver that report, that person's going to be able to answer your detailed questions, right? Your developers may say, hey, I don't understand why SQL injection's a problem, right? We're not even storing anything important in the database. And that's when you start getting, okay, well, what about XP command shell, right? What about the fact that I can actually do OS calls? And so let me put together a POC for you, and I'm going to ping your server on the other side of your network from the public internet through your website. So, having a developer, like you said, kind of lends it also to help solve problems,
For sure.
So one last thing, let's say that, I understand how web app pen test works. I understand now, how to know that I'm getting a good one. What should I expect the process to look like when I'm scoping, having the work done? Should I do that in a production environment? What does that kind of process look like for someone to get a web app pen test?
Okay. So, man, scoping, that's such a complex topic.
It is. It
So,
is.
so for starters, I would say, when it comes to scoping, one, you definitely care about how large the web app is. If you have a ton of endpoints, that needs to be discussed up front. And, whoever's going to perform the test is going to ask about that. They're going to ask about how large is your web app? How many endpoints do you have? How many of those are static pages versus them being dynamic? Because the dynamic ones we really care about, and particularly, how many of those endpoints are your end users performing a function, whether it's inputting, uploading, anything along those lines.
Right.
That falls into scoping. Something else that you'll want to consider, we touched on earlier, how many roles do you have for your web app? So, do you have a normal user account? What about, any privilege roles, things of that nature? That's going to be a part of scoping.
Sure.
And so that's going to be, an all-encompassing package. Let's see here.
And to be clear, the reason we ask about the size of the web app and the roles is, we're trying to estimate effort.
Yep.
And that's really kind of the end goal there, is so we can give you a accurate a price and an accurate number of days of work that we have to do so we can schedule it properly. And so if you can imagine for a moment, Amazon.com is a very large, very complex site. And there are also multiple user roles, right? So, like on the business side of Amazon, you have admins, you have purchasers, you have accounting, and each one of those roles has their own kind of subsection that's important to them in the site. So we almost have to re-pen test certain portions of the site under each one of the roles to make sure that, you used a great example earlier. If a user can just type in /admin and load up the admin panel, then you have a problem. And those are the kind of things we want to test. And that's why it's so important that you understand how many endpoints, if you have an API, how many dynamic pages, things I can play with. And then, of course, we have to look at the static pages too, usually for simple stuff. But yeah, so that's why we ask all those questions.
Which, if you're not doing it, make sure you're taking an asset inventory of your endpoints. I think that's one thing. If you are going to do a pen test, particularly an API pen test, yeah, knowing your endpoints is super important.
It's critical.
Yeah,
we can't do the work without it.
Yeah, that's something I think we see from time to time.
Yeah.
And it just kind of goes back to like the basis of security as a whole. If you don't know about it, how can you implement the proper controls to protect it?
Agreed. And we kind of treat web apps and APIs the same, right?
Yep.
Generally speaking, they're both, an API is just a super simple web app, so we treat them in the same category. You're going to end up going through the same process regardless. And in most cases, people have both.
Yep.
Cool. So okay, that makes sense to me. And then at the end, I'm going to get a report, right? I'm going to get some kind of draft report where we're going to go over the findings. Does it work kind of like the other pen test stuff works with that regard?
Yeah, so it should be pretty simple where you should go through all the findings. You should also at some point be references and documentation to kind of further explain those findings and why it's important. And then, like with all pen tests, the sign of a really good pen tester or that you're working with a good company is that they're not just going to dump a report of findings and say, "Hey, bye, figure it out."
Yeah.
They're going to sit and work through remediating those findings. So, so I think prime example is a lot of times we'll have wrap up meetings and we'll have executives sit in on those meetings, and we'll present everything at that high level. But at some point, we're going to want to turn around and we're going to want to have a really technical meeting with the actual developers or IT team themselves. So that way we can really get into the nuts and bolts of explaining like, hey, this is what's going on. This is specifically why I was able to perform SQL injection on your web app. And these are the things that we're going to do to resolve it to make sure that that doesn't happen again.
That's awesome. And I think that's a big takeaway too, right? Is at the end of the day, the goal here, it's easy to lose sight of it, but the goal here is to make your web app more secure. And as a secondary goal, to help improve your development process, right? If we have major flaws in your app, it's again, we're testing controls with penetration testing. That means that at some point a control was either not implemented or not implemented correctly. We need to go back to where that deficit occurred and solve it. And you should get help from your penetration testing partner with resolving that stuff. So I can't think of anything else. Did we leave anything out, Darius?
No, that's I would say, well, last thing I'll say is if you're interested in doing web app pen testing, I get that a lot of like, where do I start? I would say it starts with one, make a simple web app. That's always going to be my recommendation is, build something first because that's going to be super helpful. But some resources and tools that you want to familiarize yourself with. First is going to be Portswigger's Burp Suite. It is like the Swiss Army knife of web app pen testing. Pretty much everyone is going to use it. So highly recommend taking a look at them, getting familiar with their tool. In fact, they even have free training to use the tool. So that's awesome.
The Portswigger Academy is really good.
Oh yeah, for sure. So that there's that. And really, it's to continue always be curious. That's going to be something that's also really helpful. Like I said, there are a million frameworks out there. It's tough to learn them all. It can be overwhelming. But the best part is you don't have to know all of them. A lot of times it's just the math. If you can get a solid foundation on some of the basics. So by that, I mean, how to spin up the infrastructure to host a web app. If you can learn, one JavaScript framework, if you can get the basics down, a lot of times what you'll find is you learn one language, you kind of know the other one. It's just a matter of
Yeah.
reading through the syntax.
Agreed. Agreed. No, it's good stuff, man. And I mean, the cost of Burp Suite and to learn how to do some of the basics is really low.
Yeah.
So, I guess the bar for entry is pretty low to the ground for doing some of this stuff, but it takes a lot of work to master, and that's why, we're super excited to do what we do. So yeah, that's all I have for you folks. And thanks for being with us again today. And if you like what you hear, come back and see us next week. We'll drop another one next Wednesday. And more importantly, share, like, subscribe, whatever the platform is that you're consuming us on. And we will see you next week.